Okay, so we're going to look at Terry Eagleton's Literary Theory and Introduction. This is the second edition, but there are more recent. I think there's a golden anniversary edition out there now. But this one was first published in 1983, and it became a staple of academic English studies all over the place. It was used pretty widely in the UK when I was there, but I understand it's used in North America as well. And but it is written before the Cold War is over even. So 1983, that's the context. And so in other words, the world communism is a live and very real thing in Britain of his day. And he makes certain assumptions about it, but the culture in which he writes is very different than the one that we're operating in now, 50 years on. This is 2024, but this is 1983, so 51 years on. Communism has collapsed. The postmodern literary theories, many of which he advances in the study of literary theory, are now not speculative, they are accepted and applied. And we've moved into new areas of and new different types of literary theories that Mr. Eagleton doesn't even consider because they had not yet been advanced by any scholars. And we'll get to those later on in the course. And I'm using this book not because I think Eagleton is correct in any of his assertions, but because he's critiquing certain things and making certain assumptions himself, and because he's an influential literary theorist himself, and I think moves the conversation in certain directions, because the theorists are one thing, and he isn't one, but the academics that teach about the theorists are another. They have a great deal of influence in developing other academics and the way they write and speak and so forth. And Eagleton was particularly influential, I think, in this book. So he begins with the question, and I think it's pertinent in some ways, but one that you will not actually hear being raised in the academy right now, namely the question, what is literature? That's the introduction. Here he just poses the question, what is literature? Is that a question we addressed last semester at all? I think it was. It was there. Well, certainly Plato knew what literature was, and he knew what the poets were. But he himself, I think we also said, wrote literature. Even though he is what we call a philosopher, he wrote in a very literary, persuasive fashion, and at least according to Percy Shelley, was even a poet, which is a rather extraordinary description of Plato, which he would have taken great umbrage at, I would have thought. You know, he was critiquing the poet, so to call him a poet would have confused Plato and confused Shelley's own audience as well, I think. For the philosopher to be called a poet when he's opposing the poets in order to advance philosophy. But what Shelley, I think, intended by this is that there are literary features to Plato's work, and there's something that is eternally true and valid about Plato, which is what Shelley seems to think constitutes poetry. And so it's literature in that sense. So what Eagleton means by literature, Shelley would have said poetry, I think. And I think he's going to do that exactly here at the outset of this little lecture. I'm going to read extracts from it just to give us a flavor of what he's saying. But I think that's how he begins, by dealing with the world in which he was writing in 1983. And one of the topics at that point, which is no longer a topic of concern, is whether literature deals with the realm of fiction as opposed to the realm of fact. So it's the divide between the humanities and the sciences. I think that's what he is implicitly or even explicitly engaging with there, is that proposed or presumed categorical distinction between fact and fiction. So science works to establish facts, and the humanities deal with values. So it's the fact-value distinction that David Hume makes, and which the Western world assumes up until Mr. Eagleton's day. That fact-value distinction. And facts are empirically verifiable, whereas values cannot be verified empirically, and therefore Hume will say that we have no basis for making value judgments whatsoever. And then we deal with the situation that, again, C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man talks about, whereby the things that are of utmost importance in the field of education are relegated to being subjective, personal choices, but have no claim to objectivity at all. So concepts like justice and beauty are values and evaluations that we make, but they don't have any factual basis. And therefore, the humanities themselves are relegated to a realm of speculation and personal preference, but they don't actually merit academic attention, serious academic attention. The serious academic attention is paid in the sciences that actually deal with the world in which we live in, and in a verifiable, measurable way. And to some degree, that position still holds, because most people in our day go into the STEM subjects and are abandoning the humanities in droves. And some people might assume that that is because of the fact-value distinction. In fact, that's what I hear people saying. Well, it's because the sciences, the STEM subjects, deal with facts, and the humanities deal with values, and values are really just subjective and not worthy of further pursuit. That's the claim I've read that claim being asserted. I have a different take on that. I don't think it is because of the fact-value distinction. I think it is because the humanities have listened to the literary theorists and have abdicated their own position in the academy and shot themselves in the foot by not asserting the objective value of the humanities and the necessity of a proper humane education, which has always, as C.S. Lewis says, been the real substance of an education from time immemorial. And he says, if we don't have that, I'm paraphrasing Lewis now, then we don't have education at all. So if you go back to what Augustine said about education, it's training in wisdom and virtue. That is what education is. And in that sense, the STEM subjects are not education. So we can flip it around. It's not actually education per se, if it is not also training you. So again, in the STEM subjects, let's talk about something very technical, the development of AI, the study of artificial intelligence. If you're divorcing the development of artificial intelligence from the virtuous and wise application of it, are you actually educating, or are you just giving people the power to create tools that could be used against us? And I would answer yes, that's exactly what you're doing. So then are you actually educating them? Not for anything good. You're weaponizing them to some degree, which doesn't mean that the people who are in that field are evil people, but they have not been given a proper education which would allow them to use this highly powerful tool and to employ it to the benefit of humanity, which is what an education must do, and to glorify God. You're doing the devil's work. And so that's what the STEM subjects done without wisdom and virtue in mind will invariably do. But that case can only be made if somebody actually has a genuine humane education. And that genuine humane education, I'm going to contend, is not a matter of subjective preference. It is a universally valid, empirically verifiable consequence of a good, robust, humane education. And for me, that arises in the university in the medieval period, and it's centered around the person and work of Jesus Christ. And the created order that is created by a triune God, which is, as we've seen in our little class on Shakespeare, a hierarchical system in which there is good and evil, for sure, but the good and evil are not equal and opposite sides of one thing. One is at the top and the other is the absence of that. They mustn't be seen as alongside one another on a vertical plane. There's a horizontal. Evil is the privation of the good. Note that in descriptions of the location of heaven, heaven's always up and hell's always down. Always. Why is that? I mean, again, in an Augustinian notion of good and evil, good is and evil is not. And yet we associate his goodness and his essence with a location, being up, and the devil's location of being down, even beneath the earth, in the underworld, if you will. Where's hell? That's down. Why up and down? Why not the other way around? Because we are in the hierarchy asserting an evaluation which is necessary to our own orientation and the structuring of our thoughts and the orientation of our actions in accordance with that idea. So if you are not going up the mountain, you're going down below the earth. And we can talk about that in various ways, morally, aesthetically. We talk about somebody's very refined and exalted tastes, and we can talk about somebody's depravity and their base humor. When we use the word base, we mean it's right down on the earth. So that notion of up and down, very important here. So again, that's the context in which he writes, though, is this fact-value distinction, and he makes certain assumptions about that, and I think we continue to make those assumptions about facts and values. So we haven't got away from the 1983 context entirely, but in Eagleton's day, the advance of literary theory is not nearly as pronounced. This is very radical in his day. It's being introduced 1983. This is very new to the university in the English-speaking world, and in the Western world for that matter. I studied in the 80s as an undergrad, and I can tell you that literary theory was held in high suspicion within English departments. There was an individual that taught literary theory, and he wore black, and the other professors didn't really like him and thought the theories were very radical, and they weren't sure that it was entirely legitimate either. As I say, that's a very different state of affairs than now, where literary theory is given to undergraduates in first year and is so legitimate that it intrudes upon every class as the perspective that you must take in order to understand literature or read it properly. So that's a huge difference in 50 years from being on the outskirts of the discipline. Some wanted out entirely. By the way, Jacques Derrida, a deconstructionist, was awarded an honorary doctorate at Cambridge University, and the faculty protested and refused him the honorary doctorate that the university wanted to give him, because they said it's not only that we shouldn't honor him, he should be out of the academy entirely. Now that was back in the 90s when that happened. But still, look at the shift. It is pronounced. So what Eagleton says here, I want us to realize that it's the product of a time 50 years ago, and I'm old enough to remember it. But also, is it 50 years? No, it's 40 years. Say, I was thinking I can't be that old. Couldn't possibly be. 40 years ago, but still in the context of the Cold War, and Eagleton is a Marxist, furthermore, and Marxism also has a certain leveled view of the playing field. Again, because it's egalitarian and it's committed to the ideals of the French Revolution, it's committed to an attack on all hierarchy. It disputes them. Remember, it's working on behalf of the working class. It believes that the factory owners are exploiting the working man, which they may be, but that the remedy for this is leveling things and allowing the workers to seize the means of production. It's a utopian project, but it's a fundamentally leveling one. It wants to bring down hierarchies and flatten everything out. And I think that is the opening gambit here when he goes after fact-value distinctions. He's going to even question what we mean by values. What he's trying to do is to take certain ideals that are in the academy as sacred cows and to slaughter them. That's what he wants to do. And the reason it doesn't have quite the same effect now as it would have then is because they have succeeded in bringing them down, largely, in 40 years. But not wholly. But we'll come to that in a minute. So let me just read a little extract here and so forth. So I'll just read his beginning here. If there is such a thing as literary theory, then it would seem obvious that there is something called literature, which it is the theory of. We can begin then by raising the question, what is literature? There have been various attempts to define literature. You can define it, for example, as imaginative writing, in the sense of fiction, writing which is not literally true. Now, if you were going to do that, I'm going to keep on interrupting myself on this. If you were to define it as imaginative writing, then you would be appealing to the Romantics. Like last semester, we saw that the Romantics, in the end, decided that literature was imaginative writing, and the reason that Plato would be, by Percy Shelley's lights, a poet is because he was highly imaginative in the way he presented his ideas. And that imagination changed the way the world was. And it continued to do so. And even modern science, Shelley would contend, and Wordsworth did as well, is in that sense highly imaginative. It comes up with new ideas. Note when it uses the imagination, it always appeals to novelty as well, which is not what we will find in the ancient world, by the way. When it talks about literature, it seems to think that there are certain fixed genres, for one thing, but even ideas that we are to hold on to but not invent, as if they'd never existed before. So in the Hellenistic period, they will speak about certain genres, and there are 5 different genres of literature, and then there are the great classics that represent those genres, and every literate person ought to read those great writers. And we should hold on to that because it's what they say is true, and it continues to be true. And that will be the substance of a humane, literate education. And I will say that until the Romantics, although the Romantics would have had that same education, everybody would have agreed with this. This is an undisputed opinion. To be an educated person is to have read certain core texts. And the topics that they raise engage us in what is popularly called the Great Conversation. We have Plato as our conversation partner. We can engage in Socratic dialogue on the topics that he raises in his own dialogues. And the themes and topics are of perennial interest. They don't go away. They have not become obsolete. When Plato discusses justice, his discussion remains relevant. It has not become obsolete like what the STEM subjects do. My cell phone will become obsolete. It'll become a brick in 5 years' time. Plato's ideas have not done so. They remain just as relevant. People still engage with Plato, and they will continue to do so. And literature likewise engages in certain common human themes that still resonate with us when we read Homer and the travails of Odysseus or the greatness of Achilles. We're still moved by these things. And so in that sense, things have not changed. So what is literature? Well, imaginative writing is one proposal he makes. That's the Romantic suggestion. Now, I'm going to tell you that in my estimation, largely, Eagleton assumes that the Romantics are the starting point for the conversation. He will throw others into the mix, by the way, but only insofar as the Romantics have regarded them as worthy of holding on to. So he is dominated by a Romantic worldview on what literature is, by the way. So what he introduces here is actually where he begins as a thinker. When he thinks about literature, he thinks about imaginative writing. And that is a Romantic preconception. So let's just say that at the outset. That's why we concluded with the Romantics and said, here's the pivot point. Modern literary theories, contemporary literary theories, are going to pick up where we leave this course off with the Romantics. They're going to start there and build on what the Romantics did, which is to establish literature as the product of the imagination. But that's not what we discovered over the course of the entire semester. We saw that actually the Romantics' view was a highly novel view, and it usurped certain views that existed before it. And it was highly questionable on those grounds. So let's not assume that the Romantics were right. So I'm going to be in agreement with Mr. Eagleton that he says that this is an entirely questionable view. Yes, it is. So since it's questionable, and since it comes rather late in the game, why would you not want to go to what came before it as a proposal in order to engage with the question of what is literature, or further, what is a literary theory then? You might want to look at what Plato said, and Aristotle said, and Horace said, and Longinus said, and Augustine said, and all of the literary figures that we engaged with last semester. You might want to go to them. Does he do that here? No, he does not. So he begins with the Romantics, and then he'll throw some Renaissance literary types, let me just read on here, into the mix, but he doesn't actually seriously consider their worldview at all. He just takes them as examples of imaginative writing in order to actually explode the category, because we'll see that some of them are not imaginative writing at all. So you can define it, for example, as imaginative writing in the sense of fiction, writing which is not literally true. But even the briefest reflection on what people commonly include under the heading of literature suggests that this will not do. 17th century literature includes Shakespeare, Webster, Marvell, and Milton, but it also stretches to the essays of Francis Bacon, the sermons of John Donne, Bunyan's spiritual autobiography, and whatever it was that Sir Thomas Browne wrote. He's a witty man, by the way. It might even, at a pinch, be taken to encompass Hobbes's Leviathan or Clarendon's History of the Rebellion. French 17th century literature contains, along with Corneille and Racine, La Rochefort, Foucault's Maxims, Bossuet's funeral speeches, Boileau's treatise on poetry, Madame de Sévigné's letter to her daughter, and the philosophy of Descartes and Pascal. So in other words, it's letters. It's humane letters. It's not imaginative writing. 19th century English literature usually includes Lamb, though not Bentham, Macaulay, but not Marx, Mill, but not Darwin or Herbert Spencer. So what he's doing here is exploding just by including other things and say, well, we consider this to be literature, and yet the difference between fact and value is not there in what we call literature in the 17th century. All he's demonstrating is that the Romantics' reduction of literature to imaginative works does not hold in the 17th century, but we already know that. And so he's not debunking literature, he's debunking the Romantics. So then you might want to, again, as I say, go to what a view of literature was before the Romantics to make your claim, but he does not do that. And so it's just a clever trick to make us think that he is engaging with a genuine study of what constitutes literary theory. And I don't think he is. But let me read on. A distinction between fact and fiction, then, and he has that in scare quotes, then seems unlikely to get very far, not least because the distinction itself is often a questionable one. It has been argued, for instance, that our own opposition between historical and artistic truth does not apply at all to the early Icelandic sagas. In the English, late 16th and early 17th century, the word novel seems to have been used about true and fictional events. And even news reports were hardly to be considered factual. Novels and news reports were neither clearly factual nor clearly fictional. Our own sharp discriminations between these categories simply did not apply. Edward Gibbon, 18th century Rome, decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon no doubt thought that he was writing the historical truth, and so perhaps did the authors of Genesis. But they are now read as fact on the one hand by some and fiction by others. John Henry Cardinal Newman certainly thought his theological meditations were true, but they are now for many readers literature. See what he's doing here? He's including things in just to blur the categories. Now again, what's the purpose for a Marxist in blurring the categories? And it's to equivocate, to level them all, render them side by side. Yes?
Wouldn't the distinction between fact and fiction in some way disregard the medieval view of reading as including both allegorical and literal readings, perhaps?
So what do you mean by that?
Well, an allegorical reading you would say is fictional, and a literal reading, or I suppose the works of one particular poet, you would say it's not factual in the sense that it happened historically, but it's factual in the sense it's pointing to some immaterial truth.
Yeah, the historical and our conflation of literal with historical is again product of this 18th century period where everything gets historicized. And so what we call literal is historically a historical event that is factual in the sense that it's empirically observable. And then it becomes, and that's not their understanding of it in that period. When they talk about the literal truth of something, they mean it in a certain sense. And the allegorical or the figurative is dependent on that. Remember, they said that as well, even when talking about that. And Aquinas says it, and others, that the literal truth is the principal way of reading a work. And then the allegorical depends on the validity of the literal. Right? So the extended meanings only are true insofar as the literal is the first, the platform for making the other ones. But the literal truth of something isn't necessarily a reference to its historical factuality that it actually happened. The literal truth means, well, this is the principal meaning, this is the intended meaning of the author. And we can then allegorize from that. So when Homer writes his Iliad and Odyssey, was it based on historical events? Actually, it probably was. There was some dispute over that for a considerable period of time, but then the 19th century discovered the city of Troy and the ruins of it that demonstrated that this probably was a historical event, and it did happen. It just happened to be further up from the Mediterranean than we expected because of the retreat of the sea from that time. But still, we don't read the Iliad and the Odyssey as a historical work. And Homer's audience are not reading it as a historical account of the Battle of Troy. They're reading it as reflecting on the meaning of that historical event. That's what he's doing. And he is showing greatness of the men who were there. And he's casting it within the context of the theology of his day, in which the gods are involved in the whole process and so forth. But he's not actually describing it as an eyewitness historical account. I mean, that's the perspective. There he is, there's the speaker, there's Jupiter speaking, okay. But he doesn't observe them doing that. It's not historical, but it's meant to be literal. This is what Jove says here. Zeus, I guess we'd say it in Greek terms. This is what Zeus is saying when he speaks to Athena. But we don't mean it as a historical event, but we are to take it literally. This is him speaking. So there's a divide then between literal and historical, but we tend not to make that because we so prize historicization, because it follows the empirical methodology of the scientific age, that we have effectively equated historical with literal. And I think we've done a great injustice there. Not everything which is to be taken literally happened as a historical event. For instance, I don't think that there was a debate between Zeus and Athena, or a discussion of what happened on Earth, because I don't think that Zeus actually exists, or Athena for that matter, but they represent something. And it's necessary for me in reading that to take that literally. Now again, when people studied the Iliad and the Odyssey, one of the things that they tried to come up with was, why were these works written and what was the intention here? And some suggest that these were accounts of ancient kings that had been theologized, as it were. And the gods themselves represented that. But anyway, that moves us away from the topic here. But yes, to your point, literal does not necessarily mean historical or factual. And we immediately think it is, but that's because we live on this side of the historicization of everything. And that is immediately reducing everything to the empirical, which is reducing it to the material, furthermore then. Right? But we're going to have great problems with Scripture if that's the case. Because it's speaking of truths which do happen in history, without a doubt, but are not empirically verifiable in the sense that miracles cannot be replicated right in front of our eyes. But they were witnessed at the time and not doubted as factual occurrences. For them they would be, but for us they cannot be. So therefore, although they were historical for them, they are literal for us, but not historical in the same sense. They can't be replicated. Anyway, so the whole it's the discipline of history to some degree, and it's following of the methodology, the empirical methodology of the scientists of the late 17th century that has sort of blurred our vision on this. Anyway, so back to what he says. So yes, I thought it was a good point. So Gibbon no doubt thought that he was writing the historical truth. And so perhaps did the authors of Genesis, but they are now read as fact by some and fiction by others. Again, the fact that some think it and others think that is, to me, totally immaterial. And all it's suggesting is that what we regard as literature is a subjective opinion, and it could change. It's an evaluation, and he's going to go to that in a second. And he's demonstrating what Lewis showed in The Abolition of Man, which is the idea that values actually are totally subjective and they can change. And the reason why a Marxist would want to do this is because he has great problems with the hierarchical view of life that our forebears assumed to be true, and the Bible most certainly asserts that there is a good and evil, that there is a God, that there is a devil, that there is depravity, there is such a thing as sin, there is such a thing as human nature, all of which are going to come under dispute as a consequence of contemporary literary theory. Even human nature is going to become open to question. We'll conclude the whole course with the study of post-humanism and what it does. to humanity. But it will, I'm going to give it away, it deconstructs the human being as just as a projection, and not only a projection of an evaluation, but it's a wholly negative one at that. So they want to get rid of humanism. It's not even that they want to get rid of Christian humanism, they want to get rid of humanism altogether. Humanism is a category that is wholly invidious to life. Which I think is, we can see being reflected in our own day. The attack on humanity is quite evident. Anyway, so moreover, if literature includes much factual writing, it also excludes quite a lot of fiction. Superman comic and Mills and Boon novels are fictional, but not generally regarded as literature, and certainly not as literature with a capital L. If literature is creative or imaginative writing, does this imply that history, philosophy, and natural science are uncreative and unimaginative? So again, he is taking issue with the Romantics' view of literature as imaginative writing. So there he goes. Okay, so if his points are taken, even if his framing of it is questioned by me, then again, the obvious thing to do would be to go to a definition that antedated the Romantics, but he doesn't do that, and he's not interested in doing that. And so he's not interested, to my mind, in that whether there might actually be such a thing that we would call literature or humane letters. He has a different agenda. Anyway, let me go on, because he's going to give us his first definition. Perhaps one needs a different kind of approach altogether. Perhaps literature is definable not according to whether it is fictional or imaginative, but because it uses language in peculiar ways. On this theory, literature is a kind of writing which, in the words of the Russian critic Roman Jakobson, represents, quote, an organized violence committed on ordinary speech. Literature transforms and intensifies ordinary language, deviates systematically from everyday speech. If you approach me at a bus stop and murmur, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness," then I am instantly aware that I am in the presence of the literary. I know this because the texture, rhythm, and resonance of your words are in excess of their abstractable meaning. Or, as the linguist might more technically put it, there is a disproportion between the signifiers and the signifieds. Your language draws attention to itself, flaunts its material being, as statements like, "Don't you know the drivers are on strike?" do not. Okay, so it's a language that draws attention to itself. This is the proposal of Jakobson and the Russian formalist critics, is that what literary language is self-consciously or conspicuously artificial language. So, and when I say artificial, it draws our attention to artifice. I'm going to throw this in so it doesn't come back. It's not the way we normally speak about things. It is artificial. It draws our attention to the art of language. And poetry in particular does this, because poetry is written in meter. It employs literary devices on a level that is unusual in common speech, or uses different types of literary devices. And so it draws our attention to the language, and as soon as language, which is unusual, draws attention to itself, we say, oh, that's literary. So that's the proposal that he advances as a different way of proposing what is literature. It is language that draws attention to itself. That's his first proposal, as opposed to imaginative writing. This, in effect, was the definition of a literary advance by the Russian formalists, who included in their ranks Viktor Shklovsky, Roman Jakobson, Osip Brick, Yuri Tinyanov, Boris Eichenbaum, and Boris Tomaszewski. The formalists emerged in Russia in the years before the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and flourished throughout the 1920s until they were effectively silenced by Stalinism. a militant polemical group of critics, they rejected the quasi-mystical symbolist doctrines which had influenced literary criticism before them, and in a practical scientific spirit shifted attention to the material reality of the literary text itself. In other words, they were just as materialists as the Marxists were. The Stalinists opposed them, but not because they were ideological enemies, but because they were moving things in a direction that was of no interest to Stalin. Stalin had no interest in art. He was interested in advancing politics. But their reduction of things to a material thing, that is the Russian formalists, seems to me already in keeping with Eagleton's own views of what literature is. It's a material thing. And when he talks about this, the quasi-mystical symbolist doctrines, which had influenced literary criticism before them, that's a reference to the entire tradition of Western culture. Quasi-mystical symbolist doctrines. Now, in the 19th century, symbolism arises, and it comes out of the romantic view of the imagination. But once again, that does not represent the traditional Western position, or the Eastern tradition for that matter. It's not the case in Russia either. The Romantics don't represent the Russians. Their view of an icon is not a quasi-mystical symbolism. That's not what an icon is. And that's not what art does. It's not this sort of what's being represented here. And he's paraphrasing what they thought, the Russian formalists, and I'll continue reading. Criticism should dissociate art from mystery and concern itself with how literary texts actually worked. Literature was not pseudo-religion or psychology or sociology, but a particular organization of language. So they're moving it away from the Romantics, because it's been, I think it was the literary critic T.E. Hume that said Romanticism was a sort of a spilled religion. And I think you can see that. There is a sort of a religiosity about Romantic writing, belief in the human spirit, not the Holy Spirit, but the human spirit, and a reverence for the human spirit, and particularly the imagination of the great poet. And here we have a materialist Marxist objection to any form of religion, even one that is not related to gods per se, but the divinization of the poet. He doesn't like that either. I don't like it for myself. So fine. So it should focus on the organization of language. It had its own specific laws, structures, and devices which were to be studied in themselves rather than reduced to something else. The literary work was neither a vehicle for ideas, a reflection of social reality, nor the incarnation of some transcendental truth. It was a material fact, whose functioning could be analyzed rather as one could examine a machine. So this is a materialist view of language, which is very common to Marxists. As I say, Eagleton is one, and so are the Russian formalists. Even if they're not adherents to Marx, they look at reality in a material way, because that's effectively what Marx is. He reduces life to a material reality. And as I say, it's not insignificant that he studied the atomist philosopher of the ancient world, Democritus, for his doctoral thesis, who purported that ultimate reality was to be reduced to the atom. And atoms are not hierarchical, they are just disconnected dots that can be studied as the dots, but like sand on the beach, there's no sandcastle. Or even if it is a sandcastle, somebody's built it up, but ultimately, if you step on the sandcastle, you have what it really is, which is just a big pile of grains of sand. That's what Marxism is. It's deconstructing the sandcastle and leaving you with the sand, because that's the essence of what we have there. And the structure of that is a different thing. So again, you can see the dots of sand there, or if you want to, you can build them up and create a design out of it. There's a door, and connecting the dots if you want. And so you can see a structure there, but the structure is not really there. You're reading into it. So formalism was essentially the application of linguistics to the study of literature. Now, and note that phrase, the application of linguistics. I'm going to pick it up again when we come to modern linguistics and Ferdinand de Saussure, because Saussure is also moving in this direction. And the contemporary literary theory is predicated on the view of language as a material thing, an instrument basically. So they reduce everything to what I called the material cause. Remember when we talked about theories of language and theories of literature, and what would constitute a good literary theory would be one that would account for what Aristotle defined as the four causes. It would account for the intentional cause, the author, if you will. It would include both the form that he uses, like an epic, and the specific literary devices within that, and it would also include his audience and the truths that would be it would need to include the reader in that. This puts it all on the text. Doesn't consider the reader, and it doesn't consider the author. It only considers the work of words within it, sign and signified, and the play of signifiers. That's what the formalists do. So they reduce everything to the formal cause. And that's all they look at. Now, that's a way of looking at literature, and it is looking at the specific form of literature, and it seems like it is more literary because, again, literary is more conspicuously self-referential, and this is more conspicuously reducing it to this self-referentiality. Yes?
Sorry, do they reduce it to the material cause or the formal cause?
Oh, well, yes, good point, because they're not quite the same thing. Probably the material cause even, yeah. In fact, that's why I have my notes here. But he speaks of it as formalism. I would just say materialism. They call themselves, they tend to be called the Russian formalists. They're not interested in form. Better call them the Russian materialists, because that's what we're really talking about. You're not interested in form. You're interested in the actual grain of sand and the relation of grains of sands to other pieces of sand. Maybe that's the form. But then it really is going to be reduced to not a whole multiplicity of different types of forms. It's going to be between one grain of sand and another. That's it. That's the form. Because out of that, structural linguistics will see all reality as binary. Now your ears might perk up at this point. The whole focus on binary relations, which is so antithetical to the contemporary critics of our day. We want to deconstruct the binary. When they say that, they're appealing, whether they know it or not, to Ferdinand Saussure's notion of language as oppositional. And so good attains its meaning in opposition to evil, and black in opposition to white, but only in relation to one another. And because we also associate values with that, so good is we prize, evil we deplore, part of the deconstruction of that binary opposition is to eradicate the difference between good and evil and to say it's two sides of the same coin. But it is the same coin. Let's get rid of the idea that there's a good side and a bad side. And I'll come to that when we come to it. So, formalism was essentially the application of linguistics to the study of literature, and because linguistics in question were of a formal kind, concerned with structures of language rather than with what one might actually say, the formalists passed over the analysis of literary content, where one might always be tempted into psychology or sociology. for the study of literary form. And when they say literary form, again, the literary form that they're interested in is only the one that fits with the binary view of things. Far from seeing form as the expression of content, they stood the relationship on its head. Content was merely the motivation of form, an occasion or convenience for a particular kind of formal exercise. I'll read down a little bit. Animal Farm for the formalists would not be an allegory of Stalinism. On the contrary, Stalinism would simply provide a useful opportunity for the construction of an allegory. It was this perverse insistence which won for the formalists their derogatory name from their antagonists. And though they did not deny that art had a relation to social reality, indeed some of them were closely associated with the Bolsheviks, yes, they provocatively claimed that this relation was not the critic's business. So they talked about criticism as having no social political application at all. It's just a highly formalized and highly isolated thought experiment. It's not meant to be applied, not supposed to be socially useful. This is why the Stalinists, by the way, wanted nothing to do with them. They want utility from their academics. We don't want you to sit in your room and theorize and you're not making any social commentary. Well, that's not very useful. You can't bring about the revolution, brother, if you're not willing to apply your theories to reality. But these men are monastic in their views. They want to keep it within their confines and just think about it. Many academics are of this mindset in general. But the effect of this is to see literary work as a more or less arbitrary assemblage of devices, and only later come to see these devices as interrelated elements or functions within a total textual system. So devices are not going to be what we think of as devices. They include sound, imagery, rhythm, syntax, meter, rhyme, narrative techniques. In fact, the whole stock of formal literary elements. And what all of these elements had in common was their estranging or defamiliarizing effect. Okay, so the effect of artifice is to estrange or to defamiliarize. Or if you would prefer it the way it's more commonly used now, to shock. Now, it doesn't necessarily shock in literary theory, but it will in modern art. That's the aim of the painter or the sculptor in modern art galleries. They want to make you look at something in a way that you haven't before. They're not trying to upset you necessarily. They probably are as well. But from an artistic point of view, it's not for the same reason that we talk about clickbait. It's to get eyeballs to it. It's to make you pay attention to something that normally you just walk by and ignore. That's the artistic aim. There may be a moral aim as well, which is they want to get rid of or offend your moral sensibilities because they think that moral sensibilities are appealing to something that has no real basis. It's just a subjective preference, and I want to familiarize you with unfamiliar things. I didn't even spell that right. Geez. I've always found when I write on the whiteboard, I make spelling mistakes. Defamiliarize, and it defamiliarizes to assent by familiarizing you with things that are taboo. Because within the context of a family, and familiarity is a common acquaintance. Think of what C.S. Lewis calls storge. Familiarity, familial love. We love things that we are close to and around us, our families, but also just our favorite seat, our favorite mug, our favorite music, whatever. These are familiar to us. We keep them around us all the time. By bringing things that we want nothing to do with our family into our family, we're becoming familiar with things that we would rather exclude from our family. And what literature does is it brings to our attention ways of speaking that we're not familiar with. And so we pay attention to it. That's just their comment here on what literature is. It's a language that draws attention to itself. We notice it because we don't usually speak that way. Now, I think this is a highly speculative and rather odd definition of literature myself. But at least you can see it has some basis. Yeah, literature does. We tend to refer to the very specific phrase which we then repeat of Shakespeare. What a noble piece of work is man, right? So there'll be stock phrases that we keep in the English language because it's so felicitously expressed that we want to use those same words. And they draw attention to themselves, and then we become familiar with those phrases and so forth. So they have a defamiliarizing effect. And what was specific to literary language, what distinguished it from other forms of discourse, was that it deformed ordinary language in various ways. Okay, so I can skip over that, what it says at that point, but you get the sense. So the Russian formalist critics propose an alternative definition to that of imaginative writing. And we will see that Ferdinand de Saussure, when we come to structuralism, and Eagleton is going to come to de Saussure, and I think in chapter 2 here, we'll talk about binary opposition, and effectively he is proposing a materialistic way of regarding language, and even sound. So over onto page 4, the formalists saw literary language as a set of deviations from a norm, a kind of linguistic violence. Literature is a special kind of language. Now, I would not have called literature a special kind of language at all. It's not a special kind of language, it's a special kind of writing. But note how he's moved from writing to language. But to spot a deviation implies being able to identify the norm from which it swerves. Now, if your aim is to, in defamiliarizing, is actually also to familiarize, then maybe that's the whole purpose. Introducing you to things that are taboo or to things that are outside the realm of familiarity may be to blur the boundaries between right and wrong and good and evil. And it is, and there's my critique of the Romantics, is that they were panentheists. Characteristic of the period, characteristic of everything that comes after it, is that we see good and evil as matters of perspective. They're not absolutes. Strictly speaking, we would say that they're not from a Christian theological point of view either. God is good, good is. Evil is the absence of the good. But it certainly has no common features with the good. Whereas the Romantics are going to say, well, actually, evil, even what we call evil, could have some good in it. And I would say, well, then it's no longer evil. If it has some good in it, then it's not that. But evil is actually the absence of anything good. It's not a discrete thing unto itself. Anyway, but the Romantics are going to regard all of life, every experience, as having some good in it, and some evil for that matter. So it mixes them up. And it's effectively a form of materialism. Now, it's a spiritual form of materialism, if you will. Well, that's what panentheism is. It finds the spirit in the material thing. And Marxists also do this. They think that the physical is the spiritual. And that's why they advance the common man and material life. They say this is true spirituality. To bring material affluence to the worker. Greater material affluence is a spiritual thing. And the reason it gains hold and purchase on people's affections is because they can see the plight of the poor. and wish to alleviate it. So they will throw their lot in with the Marxists, not understanding that they mean it far more radically than simply helping the poor, which Christians have always sought to do, even while they're going to maintain a hierarchy and a view of good and evil. The proposal here is to alleviate it by getting rid of the distinction between good and evil and up and down. And he goes on at great length about the formalists. Let me skip over the formalists because I find it rather tedious after a while. Let me move over to page 6 and 7. Because he then takes issue with estrangement and the view because he finds it insufficient. He's going to want to move to something else. And he, in his debunking of Russian formalism, he moves forward onto, let me go to page 7. He's reading, okay, so it starts on page 6 towards the top. And I'll jump from reading this over to page 7. He says, consider a prosaic, quite unambiguous statement like the one sometimes seen in the London Underground system. And here is the sign. Dogs must be carried on the escalator. So you can't let them walk on the escalator, you have to carry them. Okay. Now, you could, how would you understand that sign? You might take it as a sign that you have to have a dog to use the escalator. Right? Dogs must be carried on the, because the word, okay. So this is not perhaps quite as unambiguous as it might seem at first sight. Does it mean that you must carry a dog on the escalator? Are you likely to be banned from the escalator unless you can find some stray mongrel to clutch in your arms on the way up? Many apparently straightforward notices contain such ambiguities. Refuse to put in this basket. Oh, I didn't use British English. Refuse to be put in this basket. Because refuge is garbage. They don't call it garbage, they call it refuse, right? Refuse to be put in this basket, for instance, and I'm doing the Americanism in reading this, for instance, or the British road sign, way out, as read by a Californian. That's way out, man. Right? This is the way out. So it can be read and misread depending on context. But even leading such troubling ambiguities aside, it is surely obvious that the underground notice could be read as literature. One could let oneself be arrested by the abrupt minatory staccato of the first ponderous monosyllables, find one's mind drifting by the time it had reached the rich elusiveness of carried to suggestive resonances of helping lame dogs throughout life, and perhaps even rolling up and down motion of the thing itself, etc. Okay, so with that illustration in mind, he says, literature, we might say, is non-pragmatic discourse. So now he moves to a different definition. It's not pragmatic. Unlike biology textbooks and notes to the milkman, it serves no immediate practical purpose, but is to be taken as referring to a general state of affairs. Sometimes, though not always, it may employ peculiar languages, though, to make this fact obvious, to signal that what is at stake is a way of talking to a woman rather than any particular real-life woman. This way of, on the way of talking rather than on the reality of what is talked about, is sometimes taken to indicate that what we mean by literature, a kind of self-referential language, a language which talks about itself. So that's another definition here. It's language that talks about itself, not just the techniques that are self-referential, but it's language that's speaking about language. There are, however, problems with this way of defining literature too. For one thing, it would probably have come as a surprise to George Orwell to hear that his essays were to be read as though the topics he discussed were less important than the way he discussed them. In much that is classified as literature, the truth value and the practical relevance of what is said is considered important to the overall effect. It's not just the technique. Oh, I admire Orwell's style. But how about the substance of what he's talking about? Is that not important to Orwell? Is that not the whole purpose of writing the essay? Yes, but from the vantage point of these literary theorists, we don't care about the substance, we only care about the style. But even if treating discourse non-pragmatically is part of what is meant by literature, then it follows from this definition that literature cannot, in fact, be objectively defined. It leaves the definition of literature up to how somebody decides to read, not to the nature of what is written. So again, he is going through a laundry list of proposals and taking issue with them, and all of the effect of which, because I think his readers, nobody has even read the Russian formalist before they read Eagleton. He introduces the Russian formalist to their attention. No one would have thought about literature as an estranging exercise or a defamiliarizing one. But they do, and the reason they do it is to answer the Romantics. And that remains the question is, what is the response to the Romantics if we don't agree with the Romantics? So he's, to some degree, distracting us with this excursion in obscure Russian formalism. Okay, so on to page 10 now, however. No, I'll start at the bottom of page 9. The reason why it follows from the definition of literature as highly valued writing that is not a stable entity is that value judgments are notoriously variable. Times change, values don't, announces an advertisement for a daily newspaper, as though we still believe in killing off infirm infants or putting the mentally ill on public show. Just as people may treat a work as philosophy in one century and as literature in the next, or vice versa, so they may change their minds about what writing they consider valuable. They may even change their minds about the grounds they use for judging what is valuable and what is not. This, as I have suggested, does not necessarily mean that they will refuse the title of literature to a work which they have come to deem inferior. They may still call it literature, meaning roughly that it belongs to the type of writing which they generally value. But it does mean that the so-called literary canon, now he's coming closer to something that he's not touched upon yet, the literary canon, which, as I said to you last semester, was established by the Hellenistic critics, their terminology, long before the Romantics. But of course, when it comes to the teaching of English literature, essential to the actual practice of teaching in the classroom is a stable group of texts that are conveyed from one generation to the next. In that sense, a literary canon. But it does mean that the so-called literary canon, the unquestioned great tradition of the national literature, has to be recognized as a construct fashioned by particular people for particular reasons at a certain time. There is no such thing as a literary work or tradition which is valuable in itself, regardless of what anyone might have said or come to say about it. Value is a transitive term. Now, does he not sound like what C.S. Lewis describes in The Abolition of Man? This is exactly what it's being taught by the schoolmasters in the Green Book, Gaius and Titius. Value is a transitive term. It means whatever is valued by certain people in specific situations according to particular criteria and in the light of given purposes. It is thus quite possible that given enough transformation of our history, we may in the future produce a society which is unable to get anything at all out of Shakespeare. Now, when he writes this, Shakespeare is still considered to be the great author of English in the English language, and so much so that there's in Britain a radio program on Radio 4 called Desert Island Discs. I don't think it exists anymore, but it was there when I was studying in Durham in the 90s into the early 2000s. Desert Island Discs, in which the the host would have a guest on, and the guest was famous. And she would begin or conclude with, you're allowed to be on this island, and you're allowed to bring one book with you. And we're going to give you the Bible and Shakespeare, because they got tired of the people saying, I would want the Bible, or I would want Shakespeare, because they wanted to get something new. So we'll grant you the Bible and Shakespeare. What else will you use? That's simply to illustrate how seminal it was thought to be in English consciousness to mention Shakespeare. He doesn't even bother with the Bible here, because it would probably be making a different point, and he doesn't want to make that point here. But it's possible that a society may in the future be able to get nothing out of Shakespeare. Why? Because values change in an absolute sense. That's what he's suggesting. Now, he says that value is a transitive term. In other words, valuations can so change that we can transvalue all values. Now, we're going to find that that is exactly the claim of the cultural Marxists. They're going to use the Nietzschean attempt to transvaluate all values, so that what was called evil comes to be called good. And what was intolerable becomes tolerable, and what was previously considered to be righteous is considered to be hateful. It's possible, he says, because values is a transitive term. That means it can change. And the reason it can change without any consequences is because he is a materialist. And ultimate reality is simply a material thing. So values, yes, it's that we do use values, but the values actually have no purchase on what is reality, because reality is only a material thing. So things like justice and love and good and evil are transitive terms. They can change, and what is the subtext here, they should change. And the reason they should change is because this view of reality as having a hierarchical structure is, according to the Marxist, evil. He doesn't assert it, but that's his position. Back to Shakespeare. His works might simply seem desperately alien, full of styles of thought and feeling which such a society found limited or irrelevant. In such a situation, Shakespeare would be no more valuable than much present-day graffiti. And though many people would consider such a social condition tragically impoverished, just like in Brave New World, it seems to me dogmatic not to entertain the possibility that it might arise rather from a general human enrichment. Karl Marx was troubled by the question of why ancient Greek art retained an, quote, eternal charm, even though the social conditions which produced it had long since passed. But how do we know that it will remain eternally charming, since history is not yet ended? Let us imagine that by dint of some deft archaeological research, we discover a great deal more about what ancient Greek tragedy actually meant to its original audiences, recognized that those concerns were utterly remote from our own, and began to read the plays again in light of this deepened knowledge. One result may be that we stopped enjoying them. So even what we now call literature, and Shakespeare being at the top of that literary work of greats, and we hold that to be true, and Eagleton does in his day, it may be the case that in future we will totally remove that. And that is the intention of literary theory. Now, he presents it as hypothetical, but it's a hypothesis which he wants to familiarize us with. This is an idea which I want you to consider. It's a very strange idea, but I want it to become familiar. And not only do I want it to become familiar, I want you to like the idea of thinking of strange things and hypothesizing realities which we will then make real together. By thinking, because theory is just thinking. And if thinking is just thinking, then that's okay, but I happen to think that thinking is partaking of the act of reasoning, and reasoning requires that the laws of logic apply. And one of the main laws of logic which we must hold to are, we're not thinking at all as the law of non-contradiction. And Mr. Eagleton will not observe that law of logic. And literary theorists in general are very happy to assert that the law of non-contradiction no longer applies, because concepts like truth and falsehood and right and wrong are just two sides of a binary that we have constructed and can be deconstructed, because the ultimate reality is, again, the material thing behind it, the atom, which is a singularity, but is not set up into a big house. We've put the house onto we've made a sandcastle out of grains of sand. So it is a deconstructive process. Yes, you mentioned that he's deconstructing. I think he is deconstructing, but he's deconstructing purposefully. And there's certainly an outcome to it. And we'll see by the end of the course what the outcome of that is. I think that there is a natural consequence to this. But I think I'll leave it off with that because I'm done for today.